don't think anyone in Washington is interested in. I think Washington wants, at this stage, all or nothing.
Right.
There's no willingness to make any concessions of any kind. And that was the problem in Islamabad when Vice President Vance went over. He essentially tabled Israeli demands and said, here they are. So this is what you have to meet. And, the Iranians, I think, were quite perplexed. I think they came with something like 70 people. Everyone had carried lots of material with them, maps, data that was designed to support the negotiation. But there was no negotiation. I don't see any willingness to quote unquote negotiate because any negotiation that occurs has to recognize the reality that strategically Iran is in an unassailable position. We should have thought of that to begin with, but there was no thinking. Normally in the military, you have something we call the purpose, method, end state framework, where you say, all right, what do you want us to do? And what's the purpose? The purpose is what? Well, I think we went through several different ones: stimulate unrest, bomb in support of unrest, decapitate the regime, change the regime, and then finally it became cause the disintegration of Iran and its society. I mean, that's where we went. Now, the method from the very beginning was always largely the same: air and missile attack. And we know from experience, air and missile attack alone has seldom, if ever, worked. And then finally, the question is end state. What do you want everything to look like when this is over? I'm sure we didn't want the end state we have right now. We wanted Iran's total capitulation. And that's why there were these stupid remarks about unconditional surrender. When you make dumb policy statements that have no chance of success, and LBJ did this on more than one occasion during the Vietnam War, you can't retreat from it. You have difficulty doing that. That's where President Trump is. Anything he does now will be interpreted in his mind as a demonstration of our weakness, our failure. There is a way out of this, but I don't think he's inclined to take it.
What is the way out of this?
I think the way out is very straightforward. He goes out, he holds an impromptu press conference and says, I've just spent several hours talking to my advisors looking at the condition of the global economy. It has become abundantly clear that the global south in particular, but that doesn't exclude Europe because Europe is also in a similar condition, is desperately in need of all the things that come out of the Persian Gulf, not just oil and liquid natural gas and liquefied natural gas. We're also talking about sulfur, aluminum, helium, nitrogen, and ultimately fertilizer. And it's being made very clear to me that if this current conflict drags on much longer, that the world is going to suffer and could actually go into a global depression. I don't want that to happen. So I am suspending immediately, as of this moment, all further military operations directed at Iran over the question of the Persian Gulf. We will turn to intermediaries and we will find a different way forward to resolve our disputes with Iran. Now, that to me would be well received around the world. Americans can understand that if you tell them that. We have farmers that are going bankrupt left and right now because they have no fertilizer. Uh, we just cannot even begin to imagine the consequences of this. Wars always breed inflation. Inflation is rising. You know, prosperity in the United States is built on two things: cheap energy and cheap credit. Well, cheap energy is drying up, and cheap credit is going away. And if you don't have those two things, you're staring at least at a deep recession, and overseas, probably something much worse. So that would be the logical approach. However, there's a third party. And that party is Israel, its lobby, and its supporters, its agents here in the United States. They have a say. Because let's be frank, if it were not for them and the demands they made of President Trump in this country, we would not likely be at war with Iran.
I totally agree. And I want to get to Israel in a second. But the scenario that you lay out would require a lot of honesty from the president, some straight talk. We were supposed to have negotiations, or there were supposed to be some semblance, we were told, of talks over the weekend. The Iranians never committed to an actual sit down, but the president, all week said he was sending Witkoff, Kushner to Pakistan. And it wasn't until Saturday that the president said, "You know what? I called these things off. I called these talks off. I didn't send it would have been a waste of time to send our negotiators there because the Iranians don't really know what they want." Now, we don't know exactly what happened, but it sounds to me that there had been a lot of threatening over the week, and they're getting the sense that the Iranians weren't gonna sit down until they were promised certain things, like lift the blockade. Um, so it seems to me that the president is huffing and puffing and trying to blow the house down, and the Iranians aren't having it. And instead of taking the path that you have suggested, Doug, he's flailing about and continuing to threaten. I mean, he's got Scott Besson out there, the Treasury Secretary, really obsessing about how the Iranians are about to cave. They only have 2 days of energy supply. We're going to crush them. We're going to crush anybody who even does business with them. They are trying to convince the American people that the Iranians are like 2 seconds to collapse. And as you said, most of us have our own eyes and ears open and we can see what's really happening.
Yeah, well, there's no evidence to support that. I suppose part of the problem is NPD, narcissistic personality disorder. That everything that happens around Donald Trump, in vicinity of Donald Trump, has to bear his stamp, and his stamp is essentially consistent with Roy Cohn's famous three rules that he imparted to Donald when he was a young man. So you deny, 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 you attack, 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 and then you twist whatever happens to look like a victory.
Yep.
That's no way to conduct national policy, certainly no way to conduct national foreign policy, and certainly no way to conduct armed military conflict. I think the morale in the fleet is really pretty bad. There are a lot of miserable sailors, and I don't blame them. They've been out there in many cases for 10 months or more. It doesn't make any sense. The other thing is this blockade came out of the blue, came out of nowhere, and no one thought about it very carefully. When we blockaded Cuba, we called it a quarantine, obviously, for legal reasons. But when we did it, we had 180 ships at sea surrounding Cuba and also reaching out into the North Atlantic. We had 180 surface ships. We had, of that group, 8 carriers. I think half of them were submarine chasers. And then you had large numbers of submarines. In other words, we had a very large fleet. We were operating in our home waters. We had plenty of logistical sustainment that we could draw on. We could rotate in and out quickly. None of those things apply in the Indian Ocean. The other thing is that Iran is not an island. It has endless land borders. It also borders the Caspian. And it has allies within striking distance, whether that's China or Russia. And you increasingly have an explosive situation in the rest of the region. You have the Egyptians and obviously the Turks who are looking at all of this and seeing what's going on, and I think are moving closer and closer to the edge of intervention. But there doesn't seem to be any understanding of all of that. And as a result, we get these dumb pronouncements that just don't make any sense.
No. I mean, you mentioned the U.S. capabilities. Wall Street Journal had a story this week saying pretty much what we've known since the Houthi war, and you and I have talked about many times, that we have depleted our munition stockpiles to the point that we couldn't fight a near peer adversary if we wanted to. Now, according to their reporting, the U.S. has fired more than 1,000 long range Tomahawk missiles since the war with Iran began, as well as 1,500 to 2,000 critical air defense missiles. Earlier last week, CSIS reported that we had used at least half of our THAAD, Patriot, and Standard missile interceptors in the war. Last summer, Mike Friedenberg did a deep dive for responsible statecraft into our missile consumption and found that we likely burned through 33% of our Standard missile threes since 2023 when we started aiding Israel in its wars. Now, a lot has happened since last summer. We're not in very good shape, are we, Doug?
Well, I don't think we're in desperate shape, but it's not the best shape. And clearly, I think it would be a mistake to restart the war and effectively run through what remains in the arsenal. The reason for that is, and this is probably more important than anything else, We have no surge capacity. And I've got friends that have worked in the defense industry, many of them intimately familiar with the production of missiles of all types and kinds. And they've always said to me for years, I mean, this is back in the 90s when I was still on active duty, they kept saying, we have no surge capacity. If you run through the inventory quickly, it'll take us years to replace it. And I would always say, well, has this been brought up? And they said, oh, of course it's being brought up. Uh, I think you've got a problem in the defense industry. It's very eager to get its hands on all the money that is being promised right now with this grossly bloated defense bill. But at the same time, privately, they all know they can't surge production. So if we do run through another third of our arsenal so that we're up to 65 or 70% exhausted, then I think we're in very, very desperate shape. There's no question about that.
No, I don't know if you saw this, but The Atlantic, which I typically don't read, but The
I,
Atlantic published a very well-reported piece, had like 4 or 5 reporters on it yesterday, that quoted officials inside the Pentagon saying that Iran retains 2/3 of its air force, the bulk of its missile launching capability, and most of its small fast boats, which they say can lay mines and harass traffic in the Strait of Hormuz. One person told The Atlantic, those are the real threat. It also reported in the same piece that none of this reality is getting to the president, that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Dan Kane, and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth are whitewashing everything for Trump, that he only gets the Fox News version of the events in his bubble and acts accordingly. What do you think of the reporting about Iran's maintaining its capabilities? And B, you know the president and you're aware of how his inner circle operates. Could it be true that he's literally like not getting the true picture of what's going on and is reacting to this false narrative?
well, let's take the first part. You were talking about missiles, numbers of missiles. They started with roughly 25,000 missiles. My impression is that I'm being told by people who are more knowledgeable about this than I do and have access to information I don't, that they've got 18 to 20,000 left and that they do have the capacity to produce missiles underground. And that's something I don't think we appreciate. The other point is that they started with roughly 50,000 or more unmanned systems. These are the various kinds of drones we've seen used, and they have perhaps of that number 35 to 40,000 left. So the Iranians are sitting on a very effective arsenal. We haven't been able to shut that down. I don't know that the comments in the Air Force are very important. Frankly, if you look at what the Iranians have achieved, they've demonstrated that you can defend yourself very adequately without an Air Force or a Navy. The small boats notwithstanding. But there's something else, and that is General Kane. He's the senior military advisor to the president. And if he doesn't tell the president the truth, we're in a lot of trouble. And I'm assuming that he does because I have heard from people in Washington that are very close to the White House or in it that everyone sort of lives in fear of an explosive temper from Donald Trump. In other words, Donald Trump is so frustrated and so angry that he has a tendency to shoot the messenger, especially when the messenger brings news that he doesn't like. Now, I said Dan Kane is just the senior military advisor. He has no command authority. So now let's turn to Bradley Cooper. He's the admiral who is the commander of Central Command. He's directly responsible, and he has access to the president. So if we're right and the real truth is not reaching the president, or the president is simply being told whatever the secretary wants him to hear, Bradley Cooper is the man that has to go to Washington and meet privately with the president. And the Secretary of Defense cannot stop that. It's written into law. You got to go read Title 10. Any combatant commander who demands to speak with the president can do that. Now, if the president says, no, I don't want to talk to you, well, that's a different matter. But my experience with him is that he would listen. He may not like it, but he's not going to turn somebody away. This was the problem with General McKenzie when he was the CENTCOM commander and presided over that disaster that we called withdrawal from Kabul. That was a catastrophe, and he was mightily responsible for that. And he should have been relieved and then ultimately punished in some way for his failure to organize that effectively. But that's where you really have to look. You have to look at Bradley Cooper. If what we're saying is true, and I think it is, then he's got to tell the president, Mr. President, this is where we stand. If you order us to go forward, these are the risks involved, and there's a very high probability that the next round of bombings and missile attacks will not produce anything different from what we saw before. But we have a lot of evidence that the Iranians will follow through on their threats. They have the precision guided missiles and unmanned systems to utterly destroy the west coast of the Persian Gulf. And they have no incentive not to do that because those places have been platforms for attack against them. And they have no love for any of the people that rule those places. There are 67 million people living from Iraq all the way down to Oman. They will not be able to stay there. Power goes away. There is no desalination. It doesn't matter. And the place returns to being what it was, decades ago before it developed into what it is today. It'll go back to being a desert. He needs to say that directly to the president. Because remember, I don't think that the president selected General Kane to tell him no.
Yeah.
After all, he came out of retirement. He was 4 stars. He must have known this was at least highly possible, if not probable. So I don't think he was the guy who was appointed to the job of chairman to tell the president no. Presidents usually get, not always, by the way, but usually get the generals they want. The last time we had a general that a president didn't want, interestingly enough, it was Marshall, because FDR disliked all of the Army generals whom he referred to as Republicans and anti-New Dealers, which was true. But it turned out that that was the best possible pick that he could have ever had.